Okay, so this article was published by Harvard Business School on the 16th of March. So it's extremely fresh. They asked a whole bunch of their top professors to give their views on how the coronavirus, this current pandemic, is rewriting the future of business. And they came up with the following. So the first point there, organizations will develop a trust-based culture with employees. This was written by Professor Michael Beer of Harvard. And he said in this current climate, honesty becomes extremely important. And it's very important that the top executives must be able to communicate with people right down to the lowest level of the organization and hear to them from them to hear exactly what are the barriers to execution, which might include even their own leadership. So this open and honest communication in organizations, right down to all levels, is extremely important in dealing with a pandemic like this and to survive in a culture like this. This is not the time to hide anything in the organization. People must be able to speak their minds and tell the executive exactly what is going on so that they can manage the organization successfully. The second point, businesses will help customers to be more helpful. This was written by Professor Ryan Buell. And what he's saying here is that, in this climate, we should almost form like a partnership with our clients, where we work together to create a better service culture. And by that he means, it says, if you use, they use two examples here to say, is if you look at how we've been re-educated by people running cinemas to switch our cell phones off before the movie starts. That makes for a better service experience by everybody else in the cinema. Also, they use the example of how the airlines are re-educating passengers to clean up, in the space where they were sitting before they leave the aircraft when it lands, specifically on very busy domestic routes where the aircraft needs to turn around quickly so that they can take off again. So by cleaning the plane by the passengers themselves, they save on downtime and turnaround time and get the plane to leave on time. And again, that leads to a better customer experience for everybody else using that particular airline. So that's quite an interesting point. He just sort of raises a caveat, though, to say that if customers believe that you are asking them to do certain things and it's only to improve your own profitability, then they might rebel against that, and the result might be very negative for you. So be very careful. It must be a win-win scenario that you're trying to create by getting your customers involved to be more helpful in your business. The third point, remote work will become more strategic. This was written by Professor Chowdhury, and he's written a very good article on this. And he also is of the opinion that post this pandemic, remote working will become a key feature of most businesses going forward. And he mentions a couple of very important points. He says, firstly, you have to engage the help of technology professionals to help you select the best tools for your business to work remotely, i.e., what are you going to use? Is it Slack? Is it Zoom? Is it any one of the other tools that are currently available? There are a myriad of these online tools available, and you need to make sure that you pick the one that works for your business and it works the best for your business so that you can manage on that platform going forward. Secondly, he says that you need to look at your structure and your organizational processes within your business, and you might have to restructure the business accordingly if you are going to be focused more on remote work going forward. So he says in the remote world, it's very important for the management of the business not only to communicate synchronously with their employees, that means face-to-face and it's real time, but also the asynchronous communication is extremely important. And that is where you are not online face-to-face, but it's via email, for instance, where you're sending people messages via email and you don't expect them to respond immediately. Because in a remote world, you need to be cognizant of all the potential stumbling blocks that there might be for people to respond immediately. And it would need some adjustment going forward. So remote companies, he's also of the opinion that remote companies must be very mindful of the fact that people are social beings and that we have a need to socialize on a regular basis. So the fact that you're now stuck remotely and you're working from home and you're on your own does not do away with the fact that you have a need to socialize with your colleagues. So you don't have to just set up Zoom meetings or Skype meetings just for business purposes. It says that must also be used for people to socialize on a regular basis. So, you know, they can dial into, and it will be optional, they can dial into a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting, and it's purely for socialization purposes. They can introduce their kids to the rest of their colleagues, they can show them their pets, they can, you know, they can have drinks together virtually, and just have a social chat. And it says that's very important for the socialization of people and for their mental state of mind, that they still have this socialization that takes place amongst them on a regular basis. Then the next point, leadership will engage people to work together creatively. This was written by Professor Amy Edmondson. And she said that, you know, in this kind of climate, when you are forced to work more remotely, it becomes important to design and manage and master teams that are of a virtual nature. So this becomes a critical skill. How do you deal with teams, virtual teams, in this reality? And you must be able to do that successfully if you want to succeed. So, you know, you might be dealing with virtual teams where the membership changes on a regular basis, depending on what kind of project you want the guys to work on. And you need to be very clear on how you want these people to operate within this new reality. She also makes the point that the last time this many people globally started working remotely was during World War II. But she does make the point that what was different from then to now is that this happened very gradually around the world as the war moved around the world. She said with this particular pandemic, this happened within a matter of days, where people were forced to start working remotely from home. So this is very different and quite unique in the current climate that we're operating in. The next point, standard operating practice will be elevated to a new level. This article was written by Professor Joseph Fuller, and he said that, you know, in companies in the climate that we're in, obviously when we're forced to work remotely, there will be, you know, drastically reduced travel. Face-to-face meetings will reduce significantly, and this is post the pandemic, by the way. He said people will realize that they don't need to travel as much as they used to. They don't need to have face-to-face meetings as often as they used to. And this will change the business and the way we run our businesses significantly going forward. He does foresee, though, that the casualties because of this significant shift in the way businesses run themselves will be the travel industry, air travel, airlines, hotels, hospitality. You know, he says they will significantly suffer as a result from this. And he makes an interesting point to say that people that are, for instance, in the manufacturing world, you know, they can ramp up production post this pandemic, work double shifts or whatever is required, and they can maybe regain the lost ground that happened during this lockdown. But he says if you're in the service industry, for instance, he says this time is lost forever. You know, you cannot work double shifts to get more people in your hotel to make up for what you lost. He said that will be lost forever. So he sees some very dark times for people in the service industry post this pandemic. Next point, supply chain managers suddenly will have a much more difficult job. There's a very good piece written here by Professor Stephen Kaufman, and he said that post this pandemic, there's a lot of reflection going to take place by businesses, the executives, supply chain managers, as to how they can manage this better going forward. Specifically the people that are reliant on supplies out of China, or supplies that are affected by supplies from China. Because they say what has now come out is that suppliers that have been using, maybe you don't think they're from China, but they're getting their supplies from China. So you are affected by the lockdown that happened originally in China. So supply chain managers will have a much more difficult job going forward in managing supply chains and making sure they have redundancy and all sorts of measures in place if a country goes into lockdown again, like China, that they're not affected as badly as they were during this pandemic. The next point, next slide, please, Marilyn. So the next article was written by Professor Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, a very well-known professor at Harvard. She's written a number of very good books on management. And she wrote this article on the best leaders will break out of silos and improve workplace culture. So what she means by that is that so people, executives will no longer just operate in the silos that they were operating in before this pandemic, where they were only concerned about, keeping a couple of stakeholders, key stakeholders happy. They are now forced to break out of those silos and work with all their stakeholders to make sure that they're not vulnerable. And in order to get out of this pandemic, she's of the view that, executives are going to be forced to work very closely with all their stakeholders and almost form like very close partnerships and find solutions together to get out of this crisis. She says people will not be able to find those solutions in isolation. You need to work with everybody in your value chain as to how you're going to overcome this thing and reclaim the lost ground and make your business successful again. And she says you need to think outside the traditional structures of your business and make sure that you get everybody to contribute to these challenges that we're facing to find the appropriate solutions for that. She said that we need to be mindful of the fact that, people are really feeling very vulnerable and uncertain at the moment due to the pandemic we find ourselves in. And this pandemic is really exacerbating the normal resistance people have to change. This is a massive change in normal routines. Workplace practices are being affected by all of this. And she says the only way to overcome all of this is to make sure that you reinforce good workplace practices to make sure that people are as productive as they can be in the organization. And for instance, she quotes the following points. Regular and abundant communication with all staff within the organization, and make sure that you keep them informed all the way during this process. She said the worst thing you can do right now is to be quiet. You need to be talking to your people all the time, and not just your employees, all your stakeholders. You need to be communicating with them on a very regular basis. Cross-training during this time is very important to make sure that people can cover for each other when we're in a crisis like this. Flexible work schedules. When people work at home, there's work at home and then there's work at home during a lockdown, which is very different when you are stuck at home and you are there with your entire family. It's not like when you work at home on your own and everybody's at school or at work and you have the house and all the time to yourself to focus just on your work. People have their families still to run, they have work, home responsibilities. So you need to understand all of that, and you need to be flexible with your work schedules and requirements around all of this. Goal clarity, you need to be very clear as to what you want your people to do while they're at home. which is quite different to when they are in the office and everybody is working in the same space. Empowerment of people. She said it's very important, excuse me, that you empower people right down to the lowest level so they can make certain decisions quickly. Otherwise, you are going to hamstring the organization in performing successfully under these conditions that we're operating in. Then the next point, employees and buildings will be healthier post this pandemic. And this article was written by Professor John McComber from Harvard. And the point that he's making is to say that, pre this pandemic, most buildings had very strict sort of security. Most of them had, where you would check by the security when you checked in. It says now that will also be added to that will be a health check. They will screen you for viruses, or you take your temperature and all of that. And he foresee that this will continue post the pandemic. That people will become much more aware of who they allow into their space from a health point of view. So he is of the opinion that, we will see things like facial recognition cameras being installed in companies, temperature screening, machinery, things like that. Next point, in-person meetings will be less important. This piece was written by Professor Gary Pisano, and he just makes the point that this pandemic has forced us to work remotely, and people are now realizing that it's not that necessary to have so many face-to-face meetings. And he's of the opinion that this will change the way businesses operate drastically post the pandemic, and people will review this very carefully. And he says specifically businesses that are sort of dispersed over the entire country, where they need to travel long distances to see people. He's of the view that a lot of these meetings will now become online meetings and no longer face-to-face meetings. So again, significant reduction in travel, and going with that, obviously, the significant cost saving to the business. So he sees a permanent change in most businesses as far as face-to-face meetings are concerned. Then the next point, employees will take stock of their new work priorities. So obviously, it's a point that's made already, is that employees, when they work from home, mostly will need to organize their work life and their home life to work together in a way that they can achieve all the objectives that are set for them. You cannot just give the guy work commitments and not being cognizant of the fact that he's still got his home life to manage as well during this process. You need to be a bit more flexible when you demand certain results or outputs from employees when they're working remotely going forward. And then the last point there, written by Professor Shi, on supply chain strategies will be rewritten. This goes without saying, was already mentioned in the point before about supply chains, is that people will have a look very carefully at how supply chains will be managed going forward, and specifically concentration risk within certain countries. You will have to diversify your supply chain to countries that are not all, to people that are not all in the same country, to make sure that you don't get caught by something like this pandemic where we're in now, where your supply is significantly disrupted by something like this coronavirus pandemic.